For months, I endured my boss's humiliation, and now she was standing at my door in the dark, begging me for help. It was almost midnight. The light behind me spilled yellow onto the step, and out past her the hallway railing hummed the way old metal does in the wind. She had one hand pressed flat against my doorframe, the other clamped around the strap of her bag like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes were wet, though nothing had fallen yet. "Everett, please." Her voice cracked. "I don't have anyone else. Please, I need your help." I had rehearsed 100 cold things to say to this woman. Every one of them left me at once. "My name is Everett Shaw. I'm 34 years old, and I check numbers for a living." That's the plain version. The truer one is that I'm a structural engineer in Pittsburgh, and I live alone in a small apartment above the Allegheny, close enough to the water that I can hear the barges at night. No children. I was married once. These days it's just me, a coffee pot, and a walk across the river most mornings before the city wakes up. I don't own much. A drafting table by the window, a shelf of codes and standards I could recite in my sleep, and that coffee pot, which is older than my marriage ever got to be. It's a small life. It's mine. And after everything, small felt like something I could finally trust. People think an engineer's job is to build. It isn't. It's to imagine the exact way a thing will fail, the exact way it will kill someone, and then to refuse, quietly and completely, to let that happen. You learn to love the ugly parts of a drawing, the joints and the connections, the places where the weight actually goes. You learn that the prettiest span in the world is worthless if one bolt is asked to carry more than it can. I learned all of that from a man named Walt Ordway. Walt was my mentor when I was young and certain and wrong about most things. He had a saying he'd repeat until it lived in my hands. "Circle it in red," he'd tell me, tapping a drawing with one thick finger. "Circle the truth in red. Then don't move." He meant it about more than steel. He meant that once you know a thing is true, you plant your feet, and you let the whole world push against you, and you do not step back. I used to be somebody in this field. I led projects. I signed my name on things that are still standing. And then, 4 years ago, I lost all of it, the title, the salary, the phone that used to ring. I'll get to how. For now, it's enough to say the fall was long and it was quiet. And when it was over, nobody in the state would return my calls. Nobody except Ardent. Ardent Engineering Group took me on as a mid-level checker, the man who sits at the end of the line and confirms other people's math. It's honest work. It's a fraction of what I once did. I took it, and I was grateful, because a checker is still allowed near the numbers, and the numbers were the only thing I had left that never lied to me. My director there is a woman named Margot Larkin. Margot is younger than me, 31, and she runs her floor like every decimal is a personal insult waiting to happen. For 8 months she made me feel like a rounding error. She'd drop a report on my desk without looking up. "Redo it," she'd say, "and this time, try to be worth the salary." She corrected me in front of the whole room. She gave me the work nobody wanted, and none of the work that mattered. I'd walk to my car some nights replaying the day, trying to figure out what I'd done to earn that particular kind of cold. I told myself I knew what she was. Loud in the way ambitious people are loud, sharp for sport, the sort who climbs by making sure everyone below her knows exactly how far down they are. And yet, there was one thing that never fit. In 8 months of her tearing my work apart, she never once signed the paperwork to let me go. It would have been easy. There were mornings I was sure it was coming. It never did, and there was something stranger, still something I noticed, and then talked myself out of noticing. When she threw my reports back at me, marked up and bleeding, there was always, down in the corner, faint and almost apologetic, a small red circle, drawn around the exact figure I'd been worried about. The exact weakness I'd flagged, and was now too junior to defend. As if, after all the noise, someone had sat alone and checked my work line by line, and quietly agreed. I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence of the pen. I was wrong about a great many things that year. That was the first of them. That night, the night she came to my door, I let her in. I don't fully know why. Maybe it was the way her hand shook around that bag strap. Maybe it was 8 months of wondering, finally cracking open. I made coffee I didn't offer to drink, and I stood across the kitchen from the woman who'd spent most of a year making me small, and I waited. "Not here," she said. "Please. The office. I have to show you something, and I can't be the only one who's seen it." So I followed her back downtown at midnight, into a building lit up white and empty. She led me to the long table in the glass conference room, and she pulled a roll of drawings out of her bag with hands that still weren't steady. She spread them flat and weighted the corners with coffee mugs. I looked down at the plans for the Allegheny Crossing, the pedestrian bridge the whole firm had been chasing, the ribbon cutting that was supposed to make careers, and my blood went cold, because I knew that connection detail. I knew the way the load was routed through those joints. The specific, elegant, wrong assumption buried in the calculation. I had seen it before. I had circled it in red before, 4 years earlier, on a different project, in a different life. Let me tell you about that life, because it's the only way the rest of this makes sense. 4 years ago, I was the lead engineer on a project called the Varick Pavilion. It was going to be beautiful, a long, floating canopy over a public plaza, all glass and daylight. My job was the boring part underneath, the steel that held the roof up, and somewhere in the connection design, in the math that decided how much each joint could carry, I found a mistake. Not a small one. Under the wrong storm, the wrong load, the wrong unlucky afternoon, those connections would fail. People stood under that canopy. Families. On a bad day, a great many of them. So I did what Walt taught me. I circled it in red, and I refused to sign. I remember the meeting where I said no. I remember how quiet a room gets when one person won't move. How everyone else suddenly finds something fascinating in their own hands. I was 30, and I thought being right would be enough. I was about to learn how wrong that particular assumption was. The man who owned the firm was named Silas Dorn. Silas did not build things to keep people alive. He built them to keep a schedule and a margin. When I wouldn't put my name on his roof, he found someone who would. He had another engineer stamp it, and then he made sure I understood what it cost to be difficult. He pushed me out, not fired. Exactly. That's too clean a word. He made calls. He used the word insubordinate in rooms I wasn't in. He made certain that my name, in this industry, came to mean trouble. By the time it was done, I was unemployable. And the worst part, the part I still carry like a stone, was that a year later, in a spring storm, part of the Varick canopy came down. People were hurt. Not the number it could have been, thank God, but real people, a real mourning, real ambulances. And it was quietly explained away. Unforeseen weather, an act of nature. The report with my red circle in it was already boxed in a basement, and I was already a cautionary tale, and no one goes looking for the warnings of a man everyone's agreed to stop believing. I learned to read the fine print of my own ruin in other people's faces, the small pause before they returned a handshake, the way a call would go to voicemail on the second ring now instead of the fifth. I drove out to see the plaza once, months later, after it reopened and the story had been sanded smooth. New steel where the old had failed. A little plaque about resilience. Not one word about the man who'd told them, in writing, a year before it happened. I sat in my car across the street, and I didn't get out. My wife left me in the middle of all of it. Vanessa. She hadn't married a checker. She'd married a name, and when the name went dark, so did she. There were no children to keep us honest with each other. She was gone by summer. I don't tell that part for sympathy. People leave. It happens. But it teaches you something to watch the person who promised to stay do the arithmetic on your worth and quietly decide you don't clear the bar. And then, the next year, Walt died. He left me almost nothing, because he'd never chased money either. But there was a small box, and inside it, wrapped in a shop rag, was his red pencil, the one he'd tapped against 1,000 drawings. There was a note in his handwriting, 4 words, "Circle it, don't move." I read it standing in his empty workshop, and I understood he'd left me the only inheritance that couldn't be taken away. Not the pencil. The sentence. I kept that pencil in my breast pocket every day after that. It was the only thing I owned that still believed in me. So when I stood in that white conference room, and saw the same wrong assumption from the Varick Pavilion sitting inside the Allegheny crossing, I understood two things at once. The bridge would hurt people, and someone had reached back 4 years and pulled the same buried, broken math up into the light. "You see it," Margot said. It wasn't a question. She was watching my face. I've been staring at it for a week, telling myself I was wrong. "Tell me I'm wrong, Everett." I couldn't, so we started to work. That was the strangest part of all of it the nights that followed. She'd order us both terrible coffee, and we'd sit at that table until 2 in the morning, tracing every load path, every joint, checking the checkers. The building was different at that hour. The cleaning crews gone, the elevators silent, the whole floor down to 1 lamp and 2 people and a pot of coffee going cold. There's an honesty to 2 in the morning. You stop having the energy to be anyone but yourself, and the woman across from me was not the woman from the office. She was quiet. She listened. When I circled something in red, she leaned in instead of sneering. "You circle everything in red," she said one night, almost to herself. I used to think it was arrogance. A pause. "I don't anymore." "Who taught you that?" she asked another night, nodding at the pencil. "A man who's not here to say I told you so," I said. She didn't laugh. She just looked at me, a long, steady look, like she already knew his name. There were other moments like that. The way she'd anticipate my objection before I raised it, the way she'd already pulled the exact reference standard I was about to ask for and left it, wordless, at my elbow. It was as if she'd read me somewhere, long before we ever met, and memorized the parts that mattered. I should have asked her then, how a stranger came to know me that well. I didn't. Some questions you don't ask, because you're afraid the answer will turn out smaller than the hope. I kept catching things that didn't add up about her. She knew the Varick calculation, not the public story, the calculation itself, the interior detail, the exact number I'd circled all those years ago. That was buried. That was a box in a basement. There was no reason on earth a director at a firm across town should have it memorized. I noticed it, and then, God help me, I let it go because it was 2 in the morning, and she drifted off for a moment with her head against her hand, and the desk lamp was warm on her tired face, and for the first time in 4 years, I didn't feel like a cautionary tale. I felt like an engineer again. I felt like a man someone had chosen to sit beside. I told myself that was enough. I told myself I wasn't wondering why she'd chosen it. That was the second thing I was wrong about. To stop the certification, I needed more than a bad feeling and a memory. I needed the buried report, my old red circle analysis from Varick, and I needed someone willing to say out loud what had really happened to that canopy. The report I could get. I'd kept a copy. The way you keep the x-ray of a bone that never healed right. I'd told myself I kept it out of habit, or spite, sliding it out of a drawer I never opened. I understood I'd kept it because some part of me always knew this day would come that the thing they bury doesn't stay buried. It just waits for someone to need it. The witness was harder. I made a call I'd been avoiding for 4 years, to a woman named Priya Nadeau. Priya had been an analyst on the Varick job. She'd seen the same numbers I had, and she'd stayed quiet when I went down, because she had a mortgage and a family, and no red pencil in her pocket telling her not to move. I never blamed her for it. Not everyone gets to be the man who refuses. I remembered her at the old firm, careful, precise, the best analyst on the floor, and the first to go pale when I stood up in that meeting. She'd caught my eye across the table that day, and I'd watched her choose silence, and I'd understood the choice even as it left me standing there alone. When I told her the same math was under a public bridge now, there was a long silence on the line. "They told me the canopy was weather," she said finally. "You know it wasn't." Another silence. "No," she said. "I know it wasn't." I heard 4 years in her voice, the particular weight you carry when you knew, and said nothing. "It should never have been you alone," she said. "I've told myself that 100 times. It doesn't help." "It helps now," I said. She agreed to tell the truth. That was the second piece. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning. The certification board, the money, the men who decide whether a thing gets to open. I walked into a cold glass room with my old report under my arm, the pages soft at the corners from 4 years of being carried. I'd rehearsed it on the drive over, the way I rehearse everything. Every number, every likely objection, every place a man like Dorn would try to pry. What I hadn't rehearsed was who I'd find waiting in the room. Silas Dorn was already there. He'd aged, but he hadn't softened. He sat at the far end of the table like he owned the light coming through the windows, and beside him, in a chair pulled close to his, was my ex-wife, Vanessa. I hadn't known. That was the thing that hit me first. Before the anger, I simply hadn't known. She'd found the man who ended my career, and she'd made herself indispensable to him. The status she'd always wanted, she'd gone and stood right next to, and now she was going to earn it. There's a particular vertigo in seeing someone you once shared a life with, sitting on the far side of a table, dressed for a fight, and entirely comfortable in it. She'd always wanted to be in a room like this, close to a man like that. I used to think I'd disappointed her by refusing to become him. Sitting there now, I understood I'd only ever been a stop on the way. It should have hurt more than it did. Mostly I felt tired, and a little sorry, not for myself, and not quite for her, but for the two young people who'd stood at an altar once and believed such different things about what a life was for. She smiled at me across the table like we were strangers. Then she turned that smile on the board. Before we go any further, she said, smooth as glass, I think everyone should understand who's raising these concerns. This is the man you're staking the bridge on. She let it land. He was fired for insubordination. He hasn't held a lead role in 4 years. Ask him why no firm in the state would hire him. She said it kindly. That was the cruelty of it, the warmth in her voice, the small sympathetic tilt of her head, as though she were doing the board a favor by warning them about a man she used to love. She knew exactly which words would land, because she'd spent 5 years learning precisely where I was softest. The room shifted. I could feel it, the way you feel a floor start to give that subtle tilt as a dozen people quietly decide you're the problem. I'd felt it before, in a different room, 4 years earlier. The slow reallocation of doubt, the way a table full of reasonable people can turn a truth-teller into an inconvenience without a single unkind word being spoken. I knew this feeling the way you know a dream you keep having. They wouldn't, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. She did, and every head in the room turned to Margot. I watched it cost her. Everything she'd been protecting, the distance, the cover, the careful public contempt, I'd just spent it in a single sentence, without yet understanding what it had bought. She didn't flinch. She met their eyes. But her hand, under the table, had gone white around her pen. Dorn leaned toward me while the board murmured, his voice low, meant only for me. You buried this once, Shaw, he said. You know how that went for you. Bury it again, and you walk away whole. Make noise, and I promise you won't like which one of us the world decides to believe. He said it almost gently, the way you'd warn a child off a hot stove. He wasn't bluffing. He'd done it to me once, with less provocation than this. He had the money, the practice, and the patience, and he was looking at me like a problem he'd solved once already and was mildly annoyed to see back on his desk. Across the table, Vanessa was leaning close to Margot, murmuring something behind her hand. I couldn't hear the words. I didn't have to. I could read them in the way Margot's jaw tightened. He'll destroy this the way he destroys everything. Sign the certification. Cut him loose. Save yourself. And the terrible thing was, from where Margot sat, it was good advice. I was a liability, with a history. Signing was the safe move. The survivable one. Every reasonable person in that room would have told her to make it. Dorn held all the cards, a seat on Arden's board, a phone call that could take her job, an entire career built on making the honest choice look like the reckless one. The room tilted further toward him. I could feel the certification getting closer, the way you feel a train before you see it. Everything I had, the report, the witness, 4 years of being right and buried anyway, suddenly felt very thin against a man like that. For one long, sinking moment, I believed we were going to lose. And then I remembered I'd stood in a room like this one before, and lost, and I decided I was done losing this particular kind of room to this particular man. So I stopped trying to win the room. I just laid the truth on the table. It's the only move I've ever really trusted. You can't out-talk a man like Silas Dorn. He's better at talking than I'll ever be, but he can't argue with a joint that won't hold. Steel doesn't care who in the room is more persuasive. Literally, I laid it down. I opened my old Varick report and set it beside the Allegheny drawings, side by side, and I let the pages speak. Same assumption. Same joint. The same red circle, 4 years apart, drawn in the same hand. I didn't argue my record, and I didn't defend myself. I just kept a finger on the page and walked them from the load down through the joint to the number that couldn't hold it, and then I laid the Allegheny sheet beside it, and did it again, and let them watch the two mistakes rhyme. An engineer will believe a page over a person almost every time. It's the one thing about us I've always been grateful for. You can lie to a board, you cannot lie to a load path. It fails exactly where the arithmetic says it will, and the arithmetic was sitting right there in front of them. Then Priya spoke. She told them about the canopy. Not the weather, the math. She told them what had really come down that spring, and why, and who had known. Her voice shook, and she said it anyway, and when she was done the room had gone very quiet. No one interrupted her. Not even Dorn. There's a kind of quiet a room makes when it stops deciding whether to believe you and simply does a settling, like weight finding its footing. I'd waited 4 years to feel a room do that. I hadn't known how much I still needed it. The vote wasn't close. 7-1 to halt certification, pending a full independent review. The one was Dorn's, and he cast it staring straight at me. I held his eyes, and I didn't move. Walt would have liked that part. By the end of that week, the review had grown teeth. His reuse of a known defective design across 2 public projects was no longer a rumor in a basement. It was an open file, with investigators' names on it. Vanessa, who had built her footing entirely on standing next to him, felt the ground go the moment it went for him. That's the trouble with borrowing your power from another person. When they fall, it turns out you were never really standing at all. But that isn't the part I remember most. The part I remember is after. The board filed out. The lights on the far side of the room clicked off on their timer, and it was just Margot and me at that long table, with a soft rain starting up against the glass. You humiliated me for 8 months, I said. Not angry. I just needed to hear her say it. To keep them from throwing you out the door, I brought you in through, she said. The moment Dorn joined that board, he wanted you gone, a washed-up troublemaker, one signature from the street. The only way I could keep you close enough to matter was to make you look like nothing. Like a checker I'd hired by mistake and was too proud to admit it. Her voice was very quiet. Every cruel thing I said in that office was a wall I was building around you. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm telling you what it was. Why me? I asked. Of every engineer in this city, why go looking for the one name that meant trouble? She was quiet for a moment. 4 years ago, she said, I was on a review panel, a junior seat, no real vote, and a report crossed my desk that no one else would sign. The math was right, and the man who wrote it was already being buried for it. I read it 3 times, and I never forgot the engineer who circled the truth in red and refused to move, even when refusing cost him everything. She looked at me. When I finally had a floor of my own, I went and found him. And then I spent 8 months making sure the people who'd buried him once didn't get the chance to do it again. I sat with that. 8 months of small humiliations, and every one of them, it turned out, had been aimed away from me, a decoy, drawing fire. She hadn't been unable to see my worth. She'd been the only one in that building who'd ever gone looking for it. That was the red circle in the corner of my reports. It had been her all along. Sitting alone at night, checking my work, quietly agreeing, and never once able to say so, I thought about walking out. For one honest second, I did, about how much simpler my life had been when I believed she was only cruel. Then she reached into her bag and set something on the table between us. Walt's kind of pencil. A red one, brand new. I bought it the day I hired you, she said. I never found the right moment to give it to you. I turned it over in my hand. It was exactly the kind Walt used, the same weight, the same red. She'd have had to ask someone who knew, or hunt for it herself. Either way, it meant she'd been paying attention to a dead man's habits, because they were mine. The smallest thing. It undid me more than any of the rest of it had. I'd walked in that door hating her a little, out of habit. I don't think I walked back out still able to. I didn't walk out. I picked up the pencil. And I stayed. The months after were the quietest good months I've had in years. We rebuilt the Allegheny Crossing from the connections up, the two of us, and a real team this time, working in daylight, nothing hidden. It's a strange thing. To redesign a bridge with someone, you argue about tolerances, you disagree about steel, and somewhere in the middle of all that arguing you look up and realize you've stopped performing for each other, that the two people at the table are just two people, tired and honest and easy in the quiet. We were good at it too. Better together than either of us had been alone. She caught the things I was too close to see. And I caught the things she was too tired to. Somewhere in there the firm changed around us. Dorn's seat on the board went empty and stayed that way. The floor got quieter and kinder. People stopped flinching when Margot walked past and started coming to her instead. The bridge came back different on paper, too humbler, heavier where it needed to be, honest about what it asked each joint to carry, not as pretty as Dorn's version. Prettiness had never been the point. It would stand in a storm, and that was the only beauty I'd ever cared about. We fell into small habits. Coffee before anyone else came in hers with too much sugar, mine black. A walk across the river some mornings when the drawings blurred, and we needed the cold air to see straight again. Long silences that didn't need filling. I hadn't had a silence like that with another person in years, the kind you don't rush to end. I learned her slowly, the way you learn a city by walking it. That she hummed when a problem was going well and went silent when it wasn't. That she kept her father's slide rule in a drawer and never used it and couldn't throw it away. That under all the armor she'd worn for the board was a person who'd been carrying something heavy, alone, for a long time, and had finally let herself set a little of it down. I'd spent 4 years believing the best of my life was behind me, sealed in a basement box with a red circle on it. It turned out the box wasn't the end of the story. It was only the part that came before someone went looking. We didn't rush what was happening between us. Neither of us was built for rushing. It grew the way a good structure grows, slowly, deliberately, load-tested at every step. Nothing trusted until it held. None of it was dramatic. And that's what I want you to understand. There was no single night the world tilted. There was 100 small crossings, a joke, a coffee, a hand held a beat too long over a drawing, and then let go, each one tested before we trusted our weight to the next. There was the first time she laughed, really laughed, at something I said, and I understood I'd been trying all week to earn it. There was the morning I caught myself buying 2 coffees without thinking, knowing exactly how she took hers. I'd stopped keeping score of the good days somewhere in there, which is how you know they've quietly become your life instead of a break from it. Dorn's name surfaced now and then in the business pages, a review here, a settlement there, the slow unwinding of a man who'd spent decades making the wrong thing look inevitable. It never touched us. He'd finally met a truth he couldn't bury, and it had a red circle around it, and it wasn't going anywhere. 1 year later, they cut the ribbon on the Allegheny Crossing. It was a bright spring day, the river high and loud beneath us, the new steel still smelling faintly of fresh paint. There were speeches, there were scissors and a ribbon and a small crowd, and then people simply began to walk across, parents, kids, an old man with a cane, all of them crossing a bridge that would hold, none of them knowing how close it had come to being something else. I watched a woman push a stroller across the center span, right over the joint I'd redrawn a dozen times, and she never once looked down. She was talking to the baby. That's the whole job. In the end, to earn a person the right not to look down, to make the ground so trustworthy that no one ever has to think about the people who made it hold. No one claps for the disaster that didn't happen. No one ever learns the name of the report that stopped it. That was fine. Walt never wanted applause. He only ever wanted the red circle held. Margot found me at the far rail, away from the speeches, watching the water. "Still don't move?" she asked, coming to stand beside me. It was Walt's line, though she'd never met him. I'd told her about him on one of those long nights, and she'd kept him the way she seemed to keep everything that mattered. "Not from here," I said. We stood there a while, not saying much, watching the river do the only thing rivers do. I thought about the version of me from 2 years before, sitting in a car across from a plaque, unable to make himself get out. He'd never have believed this, that a bridge could open and hold, or that the coldest voice on his floor was the warmest thing in his life, or that being right could stop costing him everything and start, quietly, to give something back. She smiled, and she took the red pencil out of my pocket she'd earned the right to, by then, and on the corner of a rolled-up drawing I'd been carrying, half as a joke and half as something truer, she drew a small circle around both our names. It wasn't a proposal. We weren't the proposing kind, either of us too used to letting the real things go unsaid until they were simply true. It was just a circle, but I knew what a circle meant, in her hand. It meant, "This is the part I'm sure of. This is the part I won't move from." I looked at that circle for a long time. 2 names, 1 red line around them, the ink still wet. I put the drawing in my breast pocket, next to the pencil. I still have it. The circle's faded now, the way red does. It doesn't matter. Some marks you don't need to see to know they're holding. Some things you plant your feet on. Some things you refuse to step back from. I'd spent my whole life learning that about steel. It turned out it was true of people, too. I tell this from the other side of it now, knowing everything I didn't know then. For 8 months, I believed I was being despised. I walked to my car in the dark, rehearsing all the ways I'd been wronged. And the whole time, the truth was nearly the exact opposite of what it looked like. The coldest voice in that office belonged to the one person in the building who was quietly carrying me, who'd gone looking for me when no one else would, who'd built a wall of contempt around me because it was the only shield she had, and who'd loved me a good while before she was ever allowed to say it. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The loudest person in a room is not always the most honest one. Sometimes the cruelty you're enduring is a shield somebody is holding up in front of you, taking the blows so you never see where they were really aimed. I spent months hating the woman at my door. It turned out she'd been standing between me and that door, the whole time, the one they'd have thrown me out of. The cruelest voice in the room was the one keeping me in it. So let me leave you with 2 questions tonight. Have you ever misjudged someone's coldness, only to learn, much later, that it was the shape their protection took? And if the truth would cost you everything you had, would you still circle it in red and refuse to move? If Everett's story stayed with you, take a second and hit like. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, was Margot wrong to humiliate him to protect him, or was it the only shield she had? I read every single one.